Weight Watchers now offers access to affordable GLP-1s.
Weight Watchers has everything I need, from weight loss medications to nutrition support and help with my side effects.
With our program, our members are losing more weight with expert nutrition and side effect support.
Weight Watchers prescribing GLP-1 medications, it's been life-changing.
Better results, expert support, lose more weight, make it last. Get started today for as low as $25 at weightwatchers.com.
This is episode 358 of That Shakespeare Life. Just like the work of William Shakespeare, That Shakespeare Life is supported by our patrons. Listeners can support the work we do here and access special insider extras when you join us at patreon.com/That Shakespeare Life. Join today and stay tuned after the episode for even more details.
Hi, I'm Mike Hurl, Shakespeare scholar. Another great method for studying the life of William Shakespeare includes listening to this. It's That Shakespeare Life with my friend Cassidy Cash.
To indicate a funeral, all you need is long black cloaks and hoods over the head and a body being carried.
Welcome to That Shakespeare Life with Cassidy Cash. Cassidy believes that if you desire to successfully learn or perform Shakespeare's plays, then understanding the real life and history of William Shakespeare himself is a must. That Shakespeare Life is the podcast that helps you go beyond the curtain of some of Shakespeare's most iconic works and explore the world of early modern England as Shakespeare would have lived it, learning from the writers, historians, and performers who know it best. And now, here's Cassidy.
With all the death in Shakespeare's works, you may not be shocked that the word funeral comes up in Shakespeare's plays over 20 times. But what is surprising is that funeral ceremonies are used by Shakespeare in multiple plays to serve a specific role, almost a character in and of themselves for how they impact the plot of some of his stories. Most notably, and my apologies here for any spoilers, the play is still worth seeing, but there's an elaborate funeral for Hamlet ordered by Fortinbras at the end of the play. This funeral is said to mirror the real funeral of English poet Sir Philip Sidney that had happened in 1587. If we're going to appreciate Shakespeare's portrayal of Hamlet's funeral, then it becomes important to understand how funerals worked for Shakespeare's lifetime, what the steps and rites were involved in an official or unofficial service, and what constituted a fitting tribute to the dead. Here today to walk us through what funerals involved for 16th and 17th century England, why Sir Philip Sidney's service was so remarkable, and what all this history means we should notice when we see funerals used for dramatic impact in Shakespeare's plays. We're delighted to welcome our guest and author of Death, Religion, and Family in England, 1480 to 1760, Ralph Houlbrooke, to give us some of these answers. Ralph Houlbrooke was professor of early modern history at the University of Reading with a particular interest in social history and the Reformation. He's written several books that we will list off for you in the show notes for today's episode, but in particular, he's joining us today to talk about his work in death and funerals that he wrote about in Death, Religion, and the Family in England. You can find out more about Ralph in the show notes for today's episode, and I'll be giving you the URL for that later on, so stay tuned for that link. Before we dive into our conversation today, I want to let you know that coordinating history content, including primary documents, woodcuts, illustrations, and more, are all packed into the detailed show notes, which is available for patrons of our show. On the show notes page, you can find the Patreon button to log in or sign up as a patron, and all the extra visual content will expand on the website so you can explore all of the history while you listen to the conversation. For this week, the URL for where to find these extras is CassidyCash.com/episode 358. And now, let's get right to the history. Hello, Ralph. Welcome to That Shakespeare Life.
Thank you for inviting me, Cassidy.
In Shakespeare's Hamlet, Fortinbras orders an elaborate military funeral for Hamlet. I've read that Sir Philip Sidney's actual funeral in 1587 might have been the inspiration behind this scene in the play. What was so significant about Sir Philip Sidney's funeral?
He was an exemplary hero. He died in the Netherlands fighting against the Spanish, and he was a very highly respected Elizabethan poet and courtier, and his funeral was very elaborately arranged. So It's very well recorded, and there are superb engravings showing the order of the procession.
So his funeral went not just elaborate for having been a high-ranking person, but elaborate for anyone. It was significantly
Yes,
involved.
It was a very significant moment, yes.
What aspects of a funeral service would have allowed Shakespeare to portray one on stage? I think what I'm driving at there is in modern times, we recognize a funeral happening on stage or on film because the attendees will walk in procession, or the women will sometimes wear black veils over their face, and all of the mourners will be dressed completely in black. And visually, those are cues that let you know I'm looking at a funeral service. And without assuming those are cultural aspects of a funeral for Shakespeare's lifetime, I think I wanted to question, what were the visual cues that would have told an audience, oh, he's portraying a funeral on stage now? Were there things like dressing in black that Shakespeare would have turned to for that purpose?
You're absolutely on the right track. So to indicate a funeral, all you need is long black cloaks and hoods over the head and a body being carried. I mean, it's as simple as that for props, for showing a funeral procession. As soon as people saw that, they would think funeral.
And I assume when you say carrying a body, you don't mean physically carrying the dead body, but in some kind of container, like a coffin.
We think it must, I mean, for the sake of convenience, you'd think that normally would be in some sort of a container, yes.
Were there any aspects of the funeral for Ophelia in that play that were different from the cultural norms? I'm comparing her funeral to what would have been a real person's funeral in the 16th and 17th century. Did Shakespeare fictionalize any of that, or was it a pretty accurate reflection of what a normal person would have had?
Absolutely, he fictionalized. It's a very curious sort of hybrid funeral, because you've got Ophelia, the play obviously refers to this, makes it quite clear that she's a suspected suicide. And the priest says that but for order from on high, she wouldn't have been buried in hallowed ground. But she's buried, even so, even though she's got this special allowance, she's still buried in the churchyard, in the open air, not in a vault or in a other sort of tomb in the church. And she's got, nevertheless, despite the fact of being suspected suicide, being buried outside, she's got a king and queen following her body to the grave. So, no, we can't imagine that this is anything like a normal funeral. It's a sort of made-up hybrid.
After someone died, was the body retrieved by an undertaker? Let's walk through the steps of what would have been in place for a normal person. What was the first thing that happened when someone died?
Well, the people who have the responsibility, the executors of the will, if the person's left a will, otherwise it'll be the members of the immediate family or friends. There isn't such a thing as a profession of undertaker. If you're a person of very high status, and you want, or the family wants, a high status funeral, a proper public funeral, then you turn to the heralds to organize that. And they are the experts, appointed by the crown. They lay down every detail of how a funeral is conducted. But remember, this is right up at the upper crust of society. This is the high status people. Doesn't apply to the overwhelming majority of the population. For the middling sort, you get in the 17th century, and this is when the heralds are losing their grip or beginning to lose their authority over funerals, you get various suppliers offering a commercial service. So the biggest item on the funeral bill for most people would be black cloth, mourning wear, and black cloth for draping the rooms of the house, maybe. And the drapers or the suppliers of cloth, some of them, at any rate, offered other funeral services. On the other hand, if you were a bit lower down the social scale, then the coffin might be the biggest item on the bill. And in that case, it might be the coffin maker who would offer, as one trade card put it in the late 17th century, all other conveniences belonging to a funeral. Shrouds, mourning, I imagine that you could hire mourning dress, So the profession of undertaker developed along one of those two routes. And by the 18th century, it's fairly well established, but it's not in Shakespeare's time.
Traditionally here in the US, a body is taken to a morgue before a burial ceremony. Was there the equivalent of a morgue in Shakespeare's lifetime, since there wasn't an undertaker? I assume not.
No, there was not.
Yeah.
There was no morgue. Person would normally expect to be prepared for burial in their own home, in their house. If it was a grand person, a person of high status, then they might be lying there for some time, but not a morgue. Most funerals took place within 2 or 3 days, and only if people died far from home, was it necessary to bring them back to their requested place of burial. But very often they were buried where they died. The famous sea captain, Sir Francis Drake, for example, he specifically requested that he be brought back or buried on land, at any rate. As it happened, his body was encoffined, as was appropriate from somebody of his social status. At least I think it was. He was certainly wrapped in lead, but then the body was dropped into the Sea of Panama, where he died.
So if they're burying the bodies within 2 to 3 days of death and they're not transporting them, there's no reason to preserve the body for long periods of time. Was it traditional to embalm the bodies for Shakespeare's lifetime, or was that also not done? I hesitate to ask because that's a little macabre, but something like that wouldn't have been done in someone's home, surely.
Yes. If you were of sufficiently high status, you see, you'd have a big house. It would be done in the house, in some, I don't know.
They just find some kind of room to...
One of the more menial rooms, or perhaps just outside the house, but certainly. If you were of high status and you were going to have a grand funeral, it was going to take quite a long time to prepare, several weeks in some cases. So yes, embalming was quite common among the upper orders of society. But the embalming process was relatively primitive by today's standards. It consisted of taking out the soft organs, washing out the body cavity, and then anointing the body in spices and tightly wrapping waxed cloth round it. And then it might very well be encased in lead, or alternatively, it could be buried in a lead coffin. And we're told, nevertheless, that this embalming process sometimes didn't work. It's not always clear whether it's a malicious story. It's told of some monarchs, but by, the body burst or something like that, or there was a terrible smell. But, it's a sort of nasty story that's generated by people we suspect may have had reason to want to sort of discredit the memory of the person concerned. So anyway, so much for embalming. The great majority of people wouldn't be embalmed at all. They would just lie for a short period, and then within 2 or 3 days, they'd be buried. So, you had to hurry up and get it done as soon as possible. There's some quite vivid accounts. There's a very poignant account of a woman called Alice Woodford. This is from the 1660s. Now, she asked not to be buried for 3 days. Possibly she was worried about being buried alive. her husband records, she's just had a child, and I think she had puerperal fever or something like that. Her husband keeps a very detailed diary. He clearly loves his wife very deeply, and he's worried about her experience during childbirth, and he's deeply distressed, and even more distressed when Alice's body starts to stink horribly, so that it's out of the question to keep her, any longer. She's lying in bed, and they bind down her. They bind down her stomach to try and, it doesn't work. It's all very, very nasty. So quickly is the normal sort of order of the day. Yeah.
Well, we've mentioned coffins and even lead-lined coffins. I wonder, a custom here in the U.S. is to have open coffin funerals where the person is embalmed and they are put on display. Did that happen I'm assuming for the average person? I think I'm asking, how were people allowed to say their goodbyes? If they had to be buried very quickly, the average person would probably just be covered in a sheet or something, and people could come in and say goodbye, but they wouldn't have been displayed in a coffin. Is that correct?
That's absolutely right. You would peel back the sheet, and I imagine, and you get descriptions of people coming in to see, for a last sight of a parent when they haven't been able to be there at the actual death. I think there's quite a few descriptions of this, and sometimes they kiss the face of the dead person and they break into tears, perhaps. But one imagines then the sheet goes back over the face, and certainly most people, until Shakespeare's time, and for some probably over much of the country for most of his lifetime, people are buried in shrouds, not coffins. But you've asked a very pertinent question already about how they would be carried to the churchyard, and that must have been in some sort of box or some sort of coffin-like container, one imagines, because it's rather unwieldy to carry a shrouded corpse. So there are two examples of communal coffins that have bottoms with hinges, so they can be opened to let the body fall into or body taken out and put into the grave. Whether that was common, I don't know. But most bodies would be shrouded, and their faces, there is a convention on memorials to show shrouds with the face of the dead person peeping out. The best known example is John Donne in St. Paul's Cathedral, which is, of course, a few years after Shakespeare's death. Whether at any stage, when the person was shrouded, their face really peeped out of the shroud before finally being sewn up, I don't know. I'm pretty sure that by the time the shrouded corpse reached the grave, it was completely covered. Now, there is one thing about important people, and that is, if you are very important, you're one of the really high nobility, and especially if you were a monarch. The normal thing was, in this period, was to have a life-like effigy placed on the coffin in the funeral procession, and then visible in the church. And we are told that in the great funeral of Elizabeth I in 1603, the effigy was so lifelike that it caused the crowds to weep as she passed. Whether there's an element of exaggeration in that, I don't know.
What about transporting all of this to the churchyard or to the cemetery? Was there a hearse or some other transportation device, or would they simply be carried by, servants or family or what have you?
That's absolutely right. Your last suggestion that most people would be carried at least the last distance, and most people probably from their house to the church by friends or maybe servants if they had some servants, or tenants. But in the case of the great majority of people are probably friends. But if you were a high status person, you might very well be taken on quite a long journey, sometimes deliberately lengthened. But in the case of the nobility, you might go on a 2-day journey. And of course, if you died far from home, let's say you were Lord Deputy of Ireland or something like that, then you'd have a sort of funeral wagon or funeral carriage. And this was de rigueur in the case of even approaching the church, in the case of royal and highest noble funerals. And I think only at the end would you be actually carried into the church, although the accounts are not always precise on this. So you had a specially designed wagon, which would be covered with black cloth and would have what were called escutcheons, little coats of arms, in brilliant colours standing out against the black cloth on the wagon. I call it a wagon. The word they use is chariot.
So it would have been horse-drawn. Would it have had seats,
or
would it have
been? Yes, it would be horse-drawn. Queen Elizabeth's chariot, for example, we see it drawn by 4 splendid horses, clothed in black. I mean, yeah. Trapped in black. Trapped, that's the word. Trapped in black, you say of a horse.
Now, you've mentioned that bodies were buried in the ground, sometimes in the churchyard, but you mentioned earlier that they might also be buried inside the church. And of course, William Shakespeare is buried inside Holy Trinity Church. But Romeo and Juliet, for example, Juliet is taken to a family crypt. Which of these formats was typical for English burials?
Well, again, I keep on using this phrase, the overwhelming majority were buried in the churchyard. The churchyard burial meant that if you didn't have a coffin, then, of course, before very long, the body would disintegrate, and of course, a coffin would slow down the process for a little time. So you're buried in the churchyard, and the churchyard is sometimes cleared, from time to time in the Middle Ages. In other words, really before the Reformation, the bones of the dead were placed in an ossuary or bone house where there might be a chapel to pray with chaplain or a priest endowed to pray for their souls. So although this churchyard burial seems rather impersonal, there was a provision in that case for the prayer for the dead.
I think for the U.S. audience here, I want to clarify what clearing the churchyard meant. This was an actual removal of the bodies that had been buried there. And I feel like it's a response to capacity. Is that correct?
Yes, that's right. It's a response to capacity. Of course, there's a very vivid black humorous picture in Hamlet of the graveyard where, alas, poor Yorick, his skull turns up from the grave that's being dug for Ophelia, I think. And Hamlet imagines the remains of politician and lawyer and a courtier lying promiscuously mixed up in the graveyard. I mean, I think that's slightly unrealistic because high status people like that wouldn't have been, or at least probably wouldn't have been buried in the churchyard. The churchyard, there weren't gravestones at that period, as this is a later development, really from the 17th century. They become more common. So we imagine that there would be graveyard markers that would show where somebody had been buried for a time. So, because we often get requests in wills by people to be buried near a close family member. Now, for the minority, yes, burial in the church, either just under the floor of the church, under the pavement of the church, or in a vault. And vaults did exist in London, for example, before the Reformation, going back into what we call the Middle Ages. In churchyard burial, the eastern end of the church was reserved for the priests and the very highest status people. Vaults, you had to be a special benefactor of the parish or a very significant person to have a vault in our period. Some families had family chapels. There are several examples in provincial England of great families having family chapels where their memorials, their funeral monuments, commemorate them. Now, the upper sort of middling people, the wealthier people, during the 17th century, they developed, if there wasn't a communal vault, because there sometimes was a communal vault in London, for example, in cities, they would have something that isn't really quite a proper vault, a sort of brick-lined shaft in which you could stack a number of coffins, one on top of the other, so that when there's been some sort of aerial photography of excavated remains of bombed-out churches or churches that have been pulled down, and under the floor you see a sort of honeycomb of these brick-lined coffin shafts. So there you are. I mean, the Capulets obviously are one of the leading families of Verona in Romeo and Juliet. So it's understandable they have a vault.
That was fitting for their station. Shakespeare was doing that accurately.
Yes. Yeah.
in that way.
Does all that make sense?
Yes, it does. I understand how they have the different ways of doing it depending on what your status was in society, certainly.
Yes.
What about the funeral ceremony? What would be included in that process? Were there traditional readings like the Bible, poetry, or did someone give a eulogy? What format did a funeral follow for Shakespeare's lifetime?
The funeral service was fairly drastically reformed and pruned. Before the Reformation, there was a celebration of Mass at funerals. In the case of higher status people, a sequence of Masses. Come the Reformation, King Edward VI's reign, and from Elizabeth's reign onwards, after the short interruption of Queen Mary's reign, you've got a service that consists of prayers and short extracts from the Bible and one longer reading, which underline the Christian doctrines of the resurrection and the immortality of the soul. The burial, the interment, the committal to the earth actually comes rather early in the service as it's laid out in the prayer book. And, of course, the body is committed to the grave in sure and certain hope of the resurrection. And that's all there is. It doesn't take very long, the service. It's very bare. So what happens? Well, this is interesting because I think, people sort of, not too flippant, they play around with it. They use it as a base to which they add things. A bit of singing, a psalm, for example. But the two most important additions, I would say, for many people, are the funeral sermon. Now, I say addition. Some high status people had a funeral sermon before the Reformation. The funeral sermon spreads down to the middling orders of society from late in the 16th century and into the 17th. And what the funeral sermon does is, of course, the basic point of the funeral sermon is to set out Christian doctrine. But in very many cases, despite the misgivings of the Puritans, the funeral sermon includes what somebody rather irreverently called a lean-to. I think actually it was a Puritan who disapproved of the practice, a lean-to, in other words, a bit at the tagged onto the end, which is a eulogy, or at least, if not a eulogy, words commemorating the dead person. And these funeral sermons, many of them are published as a sort of obituary, testimonial, tribute in increasing numbers from the very end of the 16th century onwards. And of course, the other addition for high status people, I should say the addition to the service, it's not actually an addition to the prayer book service. It's not historically an addition because it had gone on before the Reformation, but in the different context of the funeral mass. And this is the heraldic element. The heralds, they have a special ceremony called there is a special ceremony called which is the offering, in which the heralds play a big part. They offer, quite apart from the chief mourner offering money, there are the offerings of the dead man, if it's a man, what are called his achievements, his armorial coat, sword, shield, helmet. And there's a very elaborate sequence, sort of carefully choreographed, in which these are handed to the priest or the clergyman, and they're handed back to the heir, and finally returned, I think, to the church. Of course, these are not real sword and helmet. You wouldn't think of going to war in them. They are sort of replicas made of, less durable material. So you've got the sermon and the offering to add to the prayer book service, perhaps. Certainly, increasingly commonly, the sermon is the climax. And then, in many cases, the committal to the grave comes at what we might think of the natural point at the end of the ceremony. One thing I didn't say earlier when you were asking about transportation to the church is that is definitely called a chariot, or the sort of wagon. The hearse is something quite different. It's an elaborate structure in the church. That's what hearse means in Shakespeare's time. And in the case of somebody of really high status, it was an elaborate structure like a four-poster bed, in which coffin or the coffin plus effigy are laid.
So it's a display, like almost a frame or a platform?
It's a platform, yes. It's like a modern catafalque, but it has pillars and a canopy over. So it's like a gigantic bed.
And that's what the word hearse means when we see it in the play.
That's what the word hearse means in Elizabethan times. Hearse does not mean a funeral chariot or wagon.
When William Shakespeare's brother died, he specifically arranged for bells in a London church to be rang in his brother's honor. Was it traditional to ring bells as part of a funeral?
Oh, yes. First, though, I must just say a bit about that evidence, because we don't know for certain that this was Shakespeare's brother. We think it was. And we don't know who paid for the funeral. But we imagine that the Edmund Shakespeare player, who was buried in St. Saviour's Church in Southwark in 1607, was indeed the brother of the famous Shakespeare. And yes, it most certainly was traditional to ring bells in the funeral. There were different purposes for the different ringing, the different knells of bells. So there was the knell to let people know that somebody was at death's door, was about to pass away, to encourage them to pray for the dying person, then what happens after that? The Church of England tries to control, after the Reformation, the ringing of bells very precisely. So there's to be one short peal after the person's passed away, and then one again, a ring, a knell to announce the funeral, and a short knell afterwards. But what they wanted to stop was what they regarded as excessive bell ringing after the funeral. This, or after at any point after the passing away of the person, because this was associated with Catholic prayer for the dead. One bishop, it's true, early in the 17th century, did ask, do they ring the bell for the deceased person to thank God for his delivery out of the miseries of this sinful world, which is a nice way of putting it. They wanted to discourage ringing for any length of time and after death. But I think they had a hard job to control it. Of course, we don't know from this very short description exactly how long the bells would ring for Edmund Shakespeare. Of course, those two items we know about because they're entered in the church, what are called the church warden's accounts. And that's like payments for coffin burial. Coffin burial was more expensive, and that incurred a charge paid to the church. It's likely that the most expensive item on Edmund's funeral account doesn't appear from our source at all. It would be because if there was an executor's account, probably William, if he would have paid for mourning, he'd have paid for, he was a gentleman. And that's why he paid for Edmund to be buried in St. Saviour's, in the church. No doubt. He had a status to maintain. To do it, he had to do things properly. He'd have had people in mourning dress. He'd have had a really good feast, no doubt, after the funeral. And he'd have done things in style.
If we want to explore the history of funerals and these traditional customs further, what are some resources or recommendations you can point us towards that will be a good place to start when we want to learn more?
I mean, there are lots of interesting websites, but I think the easiest sources to navigate are books. And if I can show you that, is that helpful?
Oh, that's wonderful. Let's see. Death in England, an Illustrated History?
Yes. This is by Peter C. Jupp and Claire Gittings. And this has an extraordinary picture, the memorial picture of Sir Henry Unton from the 1590s, just corresponding with Shakespeare's early career. So
that's an incredible picture. He's holding it up on the screen for us to see.
And what you see on that side of the picture is a dramatic portrayal of a gentleman's funeral. Actually, I think he was raised, because he died as ambassador in France, it shows you the whole journey back from France. It shows you his deathbed and his return, and you can see all sorts of details like the mourners, the herald, the flags, the great big, the coffin being borne along, and the ceremony in the church, all shown in this sort of rather naive format. So that, I think, is the best single by Peter Jupp and Claire Gittings. And we've got then The English Way of Death by Julian Lytton. The English Way of Death, the common funeral since 1450. Can you see that?
I can see it. I love the picture on the front.
It's a great picture.
Do you know what year that's from? Okay. It looked
I don't
past
know.
Shakespeare, but it
Yes,
is
it's
pretty.
much later. Now, of course, what is especially good about this book by Julian Lytton, is that it has lots of illustrations, and he's very good on the details, the sort of details that you're interested in: coffins, embalming, the development of the hearse, the profession of undertaker, all those sorts of things. And he's very interested in the material, the stuff of
The practical aspects of what was involved.
the practical aspects, the actual artifacts, the things. I think this is a very good book.
Oh, I see you have a bookmark in that one. You've read that one several times.
Well, yes, I got bookmarks in some of these.
That one's by Claire Giddings as well.
Yes.
And what was the title on that one? I couldn't read it on the screen very well.
It's Death, Burial, and the Individual in Early Modern England. Oh, and that, incidentally, is on her cover, you've got the funeral chariot of Elizabeth I.
Okay. Are those people holding signs?
Banners.
Banners, okay. Would they be honoring her or declaring that she had died?
They are sort of banners they're royal banners of monarchs of England.
Okay.
I think.
So just her heraldic information. Okay.
Yes.
Fascinating. We will place links to all of these resources in the show notes for today's episode, along with more information on Ralph if you'd like to check out his work. Now, Ralph, there's one question I meant to ask you, and I'm going to throw it in here as a bonus question at the end. But would people have paid individuals to be mourners at a funeral? Could you have been a professional mourner, or was it always just attended by people who actually were sad about your passing?
Well, Cassidy, there's an important distinction to be drawn here. By convention, high-up funerals were in the first part of the procession. You would have lots and lots of poor people, if you want to count them as mourners. So at Queen Elizabeth's funeral, for example, I believe there were 260 poor people preceding the main body of the procession, coming fairly near the beginning, and about 300, I think, in the case of King James's funeral. Now, of course, they had an incentive. They were provided with mourning coats. There were doles at funerals. Even people of quite modest status would provide a funeral dole. But these are not the mourners I think you're really thinking about. At least I don't know. The word mourner referred more particularly to family and friends. In the case of a heraldic funeral, in the case of a high-up funeral, there were principal mourners, and their number and identity were closely regulated. So certain people were entitled, and it was their duty, they were expected to act as mourners, and there were a body of precedents governing this. Otherwise, you find in wills, people provide mourning for selected friends. Sometimes, in the case of very wealthy people, like an alderman of London, for example, it was for a large number of friends. And clearly that would be an inducement to attend the funeral. But I honestly can't say that I found that there were sort of paid quasi-professional mourners. I've not come across that.
It was more a matter of provision to make sure that the people who would be attending had the proper clothes and were able to follow convention without it being a burden on them. Yeah.
Yes, that's absolutely right. But it would depend. Of course, the feast was another inducement to attend a funeral,
which that would have been paid for out of the estate of the person who died.
Yes, absolutely. Yes.
Yes. Okay.
Yes.
We ask everyone this next question here at That Shakespeare Life, and that's, what's the one book you would take with you on a deserted island? My friends in England tell me I'm supposed to allow you the complete works of Shakespeare and a copy of the Bible, and I was told recently I'm also supposed to allow you a luxury item. So if you'd like to choose your luxury item as well, you may, but this would be in addition to those.
A luxury item. I'm sorry, I'm going to be really boring because I consulted my wife about this. After being unable to think of any sort of book that I wanted. And she suggested the shorter Oxford English Dictionary. And I know this sounds very, very boring, but what I'm afraid of on a desert island with nobody to talk to is I get to lose my sort of grasp of language. And sort of talking to myself all the time. And a dictionary like that, it not only has an immense store of words, including even now, some, when I dip into it, some that I've never heard of or never come across, but they're derivations, the edition that I've got anyway. It's got, and it did aspire, I think it still does, to be a world dictionary. It's got American and Australian and Indian English as well. So, and words that have come into the language and given their derivations and sources. I'm afraid that's a 2-volume work. So if I'm not allowed that, I would take the Dictionary of Quotations, which it would serve me like an anthology with lots of extracts from poems and interesting quotations. So one of those, you've caught me on the hop. I'm not somebody who really goes in for great luxuries, but I think my luxury would be a supply of wet razors and shaving soap.
I think that is a brilliant choice.
To keep me going. I mean, I don't mind growing a beard, but perhaps I might get a bit tired of it. And
I would think so, yes. Between your dictionaries and your luxury items, you would be well set up to maintain both your intelligence and your sense of well-being, which I think is just wisdom there in both of those choices. So excellently set up there, I think, for sure.
Well, thank you very much. I'm very pleased to have your endorsement.
I try. What's next for you? What are you working on now that you're excited about?
I'm working on the diary of a young gentleman who lived about 2 miles away from us. He kept it in 1651 to 53. And curiously enough, this diary, although it's actually in the library in Oxford, has never been edited. In some way, it's quite a short, it's almost telegraphic, but it's full of information. He was dying of tuberculosis, I think, while he was doing it. So it was he was very concerned about his health. If ever he had a good day, he'd say, "I thank God I was very well." And he keeps a register of his dreams. There are other people who recorded notable dreams. He, I think, is more thorough than most. In the somewhat over 2-year space of his diary, he records over 80 dreams. He had to be very discreet, because I think he was a man of royalist sympathies. This was at a time when the Republic, the English Commonwealth, had been set up. Charles Stuart, i.e., the man who was to become Charles II, was the national enemy, planning his return to the throne and launching an abortive invasion. So he has to be very discreet, but he's very conservative in his religious observance. It gives us accounts of his social life, his business, his management of the estate, his wife's childbirth, and his the little girls that they had together in the short time they were married, and so on and so on, all sorts of things.
Just a massive cacophony of tiny details of a life. That's fascinating.
And his huge web of acquaintance, and his he called so many people cousin or brother. He used these terms, as was common in those days, far beyond the connotation they have for us. So in the pages of quite a short diary, there are well over 300 people. And I'm just trying to identify many of them, how they were related to him, because it's very obscure. He just says, might say, Cousin Smith. Who was this man? How on earth was he related?
Yeah. Well, it sounds like a fun mystery, very fascinating, especially the Register of His Dreams. That's incredible to explore those from so long ago and to see what that was about. And I think it's neat that he lived so near to you. I'm going to look forward to seeing what you uncover with this project and hopefully to being able to read the edited version of this diary once you get it complete.
Yes, well, I'll try and remember to send one to you.
Oh, that would be wonderful. Thank you so much. Ralph Houlbrooke, thank you so much for joining me today to share about the culture of funerals for Shakespeare's lifetime and helping us understand this part of the life of William Shakespeare just that much better. I've enjoyed our conversation and I appreciate you being here.
Thank you very much. And I've enjoyed it too.
As promised, the show notes for today's episode is where you can find the list of resources and recommendations we've been talking about today, along with all the places Ralph recommends you start if you're new to this topic and you'd like to explore it further. We have all of that information detailed for you in an organized way in the show notes for our episode today. Find that at CassidyCash.com/episode 358. That's CassidyCash.com/EP358. If you're an educator in Shakespeare history, remember you can access coordinating activity kits from the life of William Shakespeare, where you can really get your hands on some of the history you're learning about from the podcast. This includes games, recipes, and crafts straight from the life of William Shakespeare that coordinate with our show and with Shakespeare's plays. Find out more and sign up today at patreon.com/thatshakespearelife, and be sure to click on Experience Shakespeare to find out more. That Shakespeare Life is researched and produced by me, Cassidy Cash. Our audio engineer is Gary Mayholm. That's it for this week. Thank you for listening. I'm Cassidy Cash, and I hope you learned something new about the Bard. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to That Shakespeare Life. As always, the best conversations happen after the episode over at CassidyCash.com. Become a part of a vibrant Shakespeare conversation by adding your voice over at the website. Until next time, remember, when you want to know William Shakespeare, you have to go behind the curtain and into That Shakespeare Life.